As an avid fan of the Final Fantasy series, I can genuinely say that there isn't a single mainline entry that I despise. Yes, including the 2nd and 15th installments. In my opinion, each game stands above mediocrity, featuring unique features and greatness at their times of release. Being a fan of other JRPG series like Star Ocean, Tales, and Trails, I still find that Final Fantasy, a series as a whole, holds a special place, particularly in how they weave emotional stories and make us care about the characters and their well-beings. It's as if they're the Pixar of gaming, where even their weakest entries can even match the best of other franchises. To put it simply, Final Fantasy is my favorite JRPG series. But while I hold these games dear, I'm not blind to their flaws. In this video, we'll be nitpicking the worst aspects of each Final Fantasy game, not to diminish their greatness, but to acknowledge and examine their imperfections. Final Fantasy. Starting with the original Final Fantasy, the game that started it all. Its major drawback is its outdated gameplay and mechanics. The grinding required to level up and progress can be an absolute chore, particularly for those accustomed to more modern RPGs. The story, while groundbreaking for its time, is quite simple and lacks the depth and complexity of later entries in the series. The game also suffers from a lack of character development, as the 4 Warriors of Light are essentially blank slates. Finally, the original release contained numerous bugs and issues that hindered the overall experience, though later remasters have thankfully addressed many of these problems. Final Fantasy II. Moving on to Final Fantasy II, the game introduced an unconventional leveling system that, while innovative, often felt unintuitive and frustrating. Instead of gaining experience points and leveling up through traditional means, character stats improved based on their actions in battle, leading to some tedious grinding sessions. The story, though more engaging than the first game, still lacked the narrative depth and character development that would come to define the series. The game's dungeons were often criticized for their confusing layouts and excessive backtracking, which could be a major annoyance for players. The encounter rate could feel quite high, resulting in frequent interruptions to exploration. Lastly, while the game's soundtrack was an improvement over the original, it still hadn't quite reached the heights that would become synonymous with the Final Fantasy name. Final Fantasy III. As we move to Final Fantasy III, the game's difficulty spikes are a significant point of contention for many players, with some bosses and areas presenting a considerable challenge that can lead to frustration. The game's story is relatively straightforward and lacks the emotional depth of later entries in the series, while the job system added variety and customization options. The need to grind job levels separately from character levels could become tiresome. The lack of a proper save system within dungeons made tackling the more challenging areas even more daunting. Additionally, the original Famicom version was never officially released outside of Japan, making it less accessible to international audiences. Lastly, same with the earlier installments, while the soundtrack has its memorable moments, it's not quite as iconic as the scores from subsequent games. Final Fantasy IV. In the case of Final Fantasy IV, the game's linear nature and lack of side quests can feel limiting compared to other entries in the series. The story, though more memorable and emotional than previous games, does suffer from some cliches and predictable twists. The game's difficulty can be quite inconsistent, with some segments presenting a significant challenge. while others feel overly easy. The inability to swap party members as well as their frequent comings and goings can lead to frustration when players become attached to certain characters. Some players may find the character progression to be somewhat restrictive, as each character's abilities and roles are predetermined. Lastly, while the game's soundtrack is excellent overall, it still doesn't quite reach the same heights as later entries in the series. Final Fantasy V. Regarding Final Fantasy V, the game's story is often criticized for being less poignant and emotionally resonant than other entries in the series. The narrative tends to take a backseat to the gameplay, with less emphasis on character development and emotional story beats. While the job system is a standout feature, it can be overwhelming for newcomers, with the sheer number of options leading to analysis paralysis. The game's difficulty can be uneven, with some bosses and areas proving to be disproportionately challenging. The graphics, while charming, lacks the polish and detail seen in later 2D entries like Final Fantasy VI. Finally, again, though the soundtrack is fantastic, it isn't as widely recognized or celebrated as some of the other games in the series. We're not there yet. Final Fantasy VI. Turning to Final Fantasy VI, one of the most universally praised entries in the series. It's a challenge to nitpick, but I'll give it a go. The game's second half, known as the World of Ruin, can feel disjointed and overwhelming, as it shifts from a linear narrative to a more open-world structure. While the large cast of characters allows for diverse gameplay experiences, it can also make it difficult for players to fully invest in each individual story. The Esper system, which governs character progression and magic acquisition, can be unintuitive for newcomers and may lead to suboptimal character builds. Some players may find that the game's difficulty doesn't always scale well with character progression, leading to certain segments being too easy or overly challenging. Now we get to the music. The musical masterpieces from this game and the subsequent ones are truly remarkable, and I can't bring myself to say anything negative about them. In fact, I don't want to. I simply can't stomach it. And before I fail even more miserably, let's move on to the next one. Final Fantasy VII. For Final Fantasy VII, it's impossible to nitpick anything from this perfect game. Just kidding. Although it's one of my all-time favorite games and my most favorite Final Fantasy game, there are some problems to nitpick. Yes, Final Fantasy VII is a highly acclaimed entry in the series, but we must acknowledge that its original graphics have aged considerably and can be off-putting for some modern players. The translation in the original release contained numerous errors and awkward phrasings, which could detract from the storytelling experience. The game's materia system, while versatile and engaging, can be overwhelming for those new to the series. Some minigames and side quests such as chocobo breeding and racing can feel tedious and time-consuming, despite their optional nature. Final Fantasy VIII. For Final Fantasy VIII, one major point of contention is the game's unique junction system, which can be confusing and unintuitive, particularly for players who are new to the series. The reliance on drawing magic from enemies can feel tedious and encourages players to avoid using magic in battle, which can detract from the gameplay experience. The story, while ambitious and intriguing, can be difficult to follow due to its convoluted narrative and controversial twists. The game's difficulty scaling, which is based on the player's character levels, can lead to uneven difficulty spikes and encourage players to avoid leveling up. The triple triad card game, while it has a certain charm, has inconsistent rules that can change between regions and opponents, causing frustration for players. Final Fantasy IX. As we consider Final Fantasy IX, the game's slow battle system and lengthy summon animations are often cited as major drawbacks, as they can make combat feel tedious and drawn out. The game's trance system, which activates automatically when a character's trance gauge fills, can be difficult to manage and may trigger at inopportune times. The story, while charming, does occasionally suffer from pacing issues, particularly in the latter half of the game. The Tetramaster card game can't hold a candle to the more popular triple triad from Final Fantasy VIII, and it can feel overly complicated. Some players may find the game's reliance on traditional RPG mechanics and tropes to be less innovative than other entries in the series. Final Fantasy X. When it comes to Final Fantasy X, one primary issue players often mention is the game's linearity, which limits exploration and side quests, especially in comparison to previous entries in the series. The voice acting, while it's the very first one in the series, can be hit or miss, with certain performances and lines coming across as awkward or stilted. The game's sphere grid, which governs character progression, can be overwhelming for newcomers, and the process of unlocking certain abilities or stat boosts can feel convoluted. The Blitzball minigame, a significant side activity in the game, has divided players, with some finding it enjoyable while others consider it tedious and overly time-consuming. The game's difficulty can be inconsistent, with some boss battles presenting sudden spikes in challenge. I'm looking at you, Seymour. And Unaleska. Final Fantasy XII. Moving on to Final Fantasy XII, the game's gambit system, which automates character actions in battle, can feel impersonal and disconnected. It's like with some players feeling that they're not fully engaged in the combat. It's like you're not even the one playing at all. The game's story, while ambitious and politically driven, can be difficult to follow and lacks the emotional resonance of other entries in the series. The open-world exploration, while impressive in scope, can lead to long stretches of travel with little narrative progression. The game's difficulty can be uneven, with certain bosses and areas presenting significant challenges that require grinding or extensive preparation. The license board, which governs character progression and equipment access, can be confusing and restrictive for some players. Lastly, while the game's soundtrack is excellent overall, it's not as iconic or wildly celebrated as the scores from previous games in the series. You won't feel much nostalgic emotion when you hear any of its music played. Final Fantasy XIII. As we examine Final Fantasy XIII, one of the game's most significant issues is its linearity, with the majority of the game consisting of a series of corridors and limited exploration opportunities. The story, while engaging for some players, can be convoluted and difficult to follow, while crucial information often relegated to in-game data logs. The game's battle system, which emphasizes the importance of switching between roles on the fly, can feel restrictive, as players have limited control over their party members' actions. The game's pacing, particularly in the early chapters, can feel slow and tedious, with some players finding it challenging to maintain interest. Character development is also a divisive aspect, with some players finding it difficult to connect with the game's protagonists. Final Fantasy XV. finally, we arrive at Final Fantasy XV, which has garnered mixed opinions due to its troubled development history and significant departures from traditional Final Fantasy gameplay. The game's open-world structure can feel disjointed, with the narrative taking a backseat to exploration and side quests in the first half of the game. The story, while emotional and interesting for some, can be difficult to follow and lacks the depth and cohesion of other entries in the series. The game's combat system, which emphasizes real-time action over turn-based strategy, can be polarizing, with some players finding it enjoyable while others miss the traditional combat mechanics. The game's pacing can be inconsistent, with a more linear and narrative-driven second half that contrasts sharply with the open-world exploration of the first half. And there you have it! We've barely ventured into the darkest corners of our beloved Final Fantasy series, shedding light on the worst aspects of each game. Remember, our goal wasn't to tear down these gaming gems, but rather to embrace their imperfections while still appreciating the unique qualities that make them so memorable. Now that we've explored the not-so-stellar side of things, why not switch gears and focus on the positive? Head on over to my The Best Thing About Each Final Fantasy video, where I celebrate the shining moments that have made the series the undisputed champion of JRPGs.